of labor. There's three concepts that we're going to work on from the outset: division of labor, the cooperation horizon, and markets. We're going to define those three things and then try to see how they interact. There's two ways of thinking about division of labor, at least. One, in a production process, it's the assignment of different parts of a manufacturing process or task to different people to improve efficiency. So when you think of a production line, that's division of labor. And let me remind you, all of these slides are up online. So rather than try to write all this down and miss part of it, you're much better off bringing that with you on your laptop or printing it out and taking notes on that, because trying to write this down is not going to work. In a society, though, division of labor is the acceptance of the complex interdependence that's based on specialization, requiring then that people meet each other's needs. And these are two related but pretty different things. In a production process, if we use division of labor, we can produce so much that we're going to need to exchange it for the other stuff we need. If I work on a production line in an automobile factory, we're going to make a lot of cars, more cars than we can use. But that means that when I get home at night and I say, "Where's dinner?" there isn't any, unless somebody else is specializing in producing dinner. So you can see how the first two parts, these two parts interact. Division of labor is used rather sloppily, and I apologize for that, to mean each or both of these things, and they're really different. One is the division of the production process into steps, and the other is specialization across people in different production processes. Specialization across people in different production processes. So it's confusing. So the cooperation horizon, the second thing I wanted to define, is the set of transactions, exchanges, or mutually beneficial actions that are organized in a jurisdiction. The extent of that cooperation horizon encompasses both space and time. So we want to know how far cooperation extends and for how long. So if you and I are engaging in an exchange, but we expect it to be a one-off and I'll never see you again, that has different properties than if you expect me to come back and buy from you every day. And the distance between us may affect how easy it is for us to exchange, how easy it is to organize exchange. And the distance doesn't have to be just spatial. It could be language, currency, culture. All of those things increase metaphorically the distance between us. So the size of the cooperation horizon is going to be determined by something that economists call transactions costs. The size, the extent of the cooperation horizon is going to depend on transactions costs. And then markets. Markets are a set of institutions for reducing the transactions cost of impersonal exchange. If I always buy from my uncle, that's not a market. It's an exchange, but it's not a market. Example of a market is when I go to Walmart and I buy, I started to say a VCR, but none of y'all know what that is, a Bluetooth Blu-ray player that someone made in a distant country. I don't know them, they don't know me. Do I open up the box to make sure that it contains a Blu-ray player and not rocks? No, I assume that it will actually contain a Blu-ray player because that's what it says on the outside. Why? Why would I think that? It's a miracle. That's only been possible in about the last 100 years. Over the last 12,000 years of human society, that would never have been possible until the last 100, maybe the last 50 years. I can go to most stores, most places, and if it says Blu-ray player inside, I pick up the box. I then go to a cashier that I will never see again, and who probably actually doesn't like me very much, but smiles and says, "Hello, how are you?" Unless I'm in Germany. Then I take a card, she swipes it through the card reader, gives me back the card, and both of us believe that some of the money, which both of us believe that I have, will be transferred to an account, and the amount will be correct. That's really pretty remarkable. All of those institutions are a way of reducing distance. All of the institutions that I just talked about are a way of reducing transactions cost. Markets are a set of institutions for reducing the cost of impersonal exchange. Doesn't need to be physical space. What markets involve is an infrastructure of transportation, trust, and transaction. So if it helps you to remember it, it's the 3 TRs. The 3 TRs are transportation, trust, and transaction. The extent of a market then comprises both the physical distance over which the goods are exchanged and the variety of goods exchanged. So the market is larger if more things are exchanged in the market. And it's larger if I can buy something from someone not just across town, not just across the United States, but someone on the other side of the world. So the extent of the market, the reason I'm spending so much time on this is the problem of the extent of the market is a complicated one. Let's go back now and talk about the origin of the state. Why is it that we have states? This is a course in political economy, so we're often going to go back and forth between state and market. And in many ways, both logically and temporally, states pre-exist markets. In many ways, both logically and temporally, states pre-exist markets. Now, John Locke, as we talked about, thought that rights pre-existed the state. But it's difficult to have an organized market in the absence of workable property rights and a workable system for transactions. Well, one justification for the state might be individual consent, and this is called contractarianism. Contractarians either think of the origin of the state as being actual or tacit consent. Problem of political authority is to justify coercion. The problem of political authority is to justify coercion. How can we say that we can be coerced by someone else? Well, one possibility would be that we consented to it. That consent would take the form of, I signed a contract, I agreed. Part of my agreement was that if I disobey the terms of the contract, I will be punished. I'll forfeit a bond, I can be jailed, I'll lose some property. Now, subjecting me to that coercion without my consent has a different status. We might be able to justify it, but consent is one approach to solving that problem. Or the state could be organic. And a number of states are states because they have been states for a long time. China, Persia, Egypt, India, these are ancient states. They're both cultures and states. They're states because in terms of human history, for all practical purposes, they always have been states. And third is religious. There is a document or event that reveals, and the key word here is reveals. So one claimed origin of states is revelation. So if your justification for the state is as a theocracy, and you're looking for the restoration of the caliphate, then it was revealed that the state should have that form. And I have a book or some document in which that revelation is made clear. Traditionally, that's a very important justification or origin for many states. So we have talked about a couple of possible origins for the state, and one of those that's really interesting is the state of nature. State of nature. So the next couple of slides, we're going to talk about the state of nature. State of nature is a philosophical creation myth. It is obviously a myth in the sense that it's hard to imagine a group of people ever having lived in a state of nature. But it's a Gedanken experiment. It's a thought experiment. What if there were no state? What would it be like if there were no state? Hobbes, as you remember, said that it would be a war of all against all. No arts, no industry, nasty, brutish, and short would be human life. John Locke thought that there were property and morals as a basis of reason in the state of nature. The law of nature then is reason. And when we do some other readings later in the semester, we're going to ask the question, could you justify a state just in having people obey the laws that they reach by reason without any coercive consent? Montesquieu, the French philosopher Montesquieu, has an interesting view of the state of nature. So it's true that in democracies the people seem to act as they please, but political liberty does not consist in unlimited freedom. In governments, in societies directed by laws, liberty can coexist only in the powers of doing what we ought to will, and in not being constrained to do what we ought not to will. So that's the key part of Montesquieu's definition. It is the power of doing what we ought to will. Liberty consists in doing the power to do what we ought to will, and not being constrained or forced to do what we ought not to will. We must have continually present to our minds the difference between independence and liberty. Liberty is a right of doing what the laws permit, and if a citizen could do what they forbid, he would no longer be possessed of liberty. All of his fellow citizens would have the same power. This is a theme we're going to come back to again and again. Many of us would like to have the right to do anything we want. But even someone who thinks that he or she should have the right to do anything he or she wants doesn't think other people should have that right. They ought to have to obey the law. Police have to deal with this all the time. They pull somebody over for speeding, and the person says, in effect, well, you have to understand, I am God's special snowflake. Speeding laws should not apply to me because I was late. And the policeman always says, oh, okay then, never mind. Okay, they never say that. What do they say? The law applies to all of us. So you give up the right to speed because you think other people should not be able to speed. So when you read Montesquieu again, he is no longer possessed of liberty because fellow citizens would have the same power. Liberty is a right of doing what the laws permit. If a citizen could do what they forbid, he would no longer be possessed of liberty. Now that seems paradoxical. The way to be free is to find a way to bind myself. But the key is, the way to be free is to find a way to bind all of us. All of us are bound by laws we all agree to, would be this approach to the origins of the state. So often it's frustrating to stand in line. Should we get rid of the rule of whoever comes gets there first and we should all stand in line? No, we all support the idea of the line, and we all think we should be able to cut in line. Those are not contradictory. I think I'm God's special snowflake. I shouldn't have to stand in line. But I still think the idea of a line is a good idea. So we have these two competing notions. Enforcement then takes the form of saying everybody has to stand in line. Rousseau's view of the state of nature assumed, his argument was, you can't assume fully socialized human beings. So you might say we have human beings who are very much as they are now, but there's no state. Rousseau just thought that was nonsense. You can't have a society without having a society, which requires a state. So the idea of a state of nature is before the state, but it's also before human beings are socialized. We don't have the experience of living in societies with other human beings. So you can talk about the origins of man and the socialization of man, but it makes no sense to think of socialized, speaking, educated people before there's a society. So the state of nature is primitive. And it isn't very interesting for Rousseau. Rousseau, instead of being interested in the state of nature, is interested in man's natural state. Let me say that again because it's subtle. Rousseau, instead of being interested in the state of nature, is interested in man's natural state. And man's natural state is the way human beings behave in a well-constructed society. The way human beings behave in a well-constructed society. Our current society is not well-constructed because it has property. As we read about last time, first thing we need to do is get rid of the notion of property. Stop emphasizing property and relative status, and we can re-socialize people. And only then can people actually live in their natural state. So neither the state of nature nor the current construction of society are good. What we need is something yet different, where we reconstruct the society without property. And as I said before, that tradition leads into the Marxist conception of how society should be reconstructed. So whereas Locke is the American Declaration of Independence and much closer to capitalism, Rousseau is much closer to socialism. The empirical origins of the state seem to be more like what the economist Mansur Olson came up with. It's more anthropologically accurate. He makes a distinction between stationary and roving bandits. Roving bandits are just groups of thieves, bandits, who go around, and if they find a farm, they steal everything. Well, if that farmer cannot defend himself and his family, he's going to stop planting stuff. Next time the bandit comes, there won't be anything. And so the bandit says, you know what? We got spears and we're big, strong guys. Why don't we just stay here and defend this group of farms and then take half of their crops when they harvest the crop? And the farmer says, well, that sounds good because I can still keep half of my crop. And the bandits still have something to steal. So anthropologically, the origins of the state might be when people who specialized in military action stopped going around stealing stuff and defended an area. Now, after a while, you start developing other traditions. Maybe we have the notion that this is something like a state, but the origins could easily be that it's more efficient to steal if you can defend, because otherwise you're exactly in the Hobbesian state of nature. So the roving bandits are the Hobbesian state of nature, whereas stationary bandits are something more like the state. So he uses that distinction to try to explain the evolution of dictatorship and, going back, the rise of Western capitalism. So the claim was not that capitalism functions well in a democracy. He said it functions well in dictatorships. And this was long before the rise of Singapore, but it's interesting that Singapore is evidence of that kind of position. Singapore is not a democracy. However, Singapore has made an effort to protect individual rights and investment. And as a result, Singapore collects a lot of taxes, even though it's a dictator. So the dictator doesn't necessarily try to take the most that he can in any given year. He might be trying to produce growth to improve the long run amount of taxable assets in the society. So again, the example to think of is Singapore. Well, let's go back further to what made the notion of a stationary bandit make sense. The beginnings of settled agriculture are the Neolithic Revolution about 10,000 BCE, so 12,000 years ago. The Neolithic Revolution sees the beginning of the transformation from nomadic hunter-gatherer societies to fixed agriculture. The move from nomadic hunter-gatherer societies to fixed agriculture. We stay in the same place and we plant crops. Now, nomadic hunter-gatherer clans saw very little of division of labor. Maybe there's one guy that makes spear points. Men and women are sexually separate in the sense that their role in raising children is different, in conceiving and raising children is different. But division of labor is pretty limited in a nomadic society. The reason that Neolithic revolution worked was that it fostered division of labor. However, there's interesting evidence that the Neolithic revolution was probably a net harm to the average individual. That is, physical size went down compared to hunter-gatherers. Nutrition went down, the quality of their teeth went down, they had more parasites, they died younger. Why did the Neolithic revolution happen? It sounds like it sucks. The answer is fixed agriculture allows you to have 100 times as many people as nomadic hunter-gatherer. Division of labor produces such an enormous increase in the amount of food and in the amount of military goods that you can produce. Because now you can have things where you can smelt metal, where you have enough young men that you can actually field an army of several hundred trained warriors. So in almost every way, the individual was worse off after the Neolithic Revolution. But you have the origin of cities. Neolithic Revolution allows concentrated populations, which increases the cooperation horizon. There's more people to specialize and benefit from division of labor. The result is you get a 100-fold, a 1,000-fold increase in population, even though the individuals are probably worse off. Living in a fixed place without any sort of developed sanitation means that you get lots more diseases, you get lots more people dying from diarrhea and parasites. Lots more. But you get a 1,000-fold increase in the amount of food that you can produce. An enormous increase in population. So what we see is permanent settlements, the origins of social classes, the rise of cities and civilizations, what we might now call civilizations. So the division of labor caused an enormous increase in output and specialization. So here's the thing that's interesting. Division of labor is limited by the size of the cooperation horizon. Division of labor is limited by the size of the cooperation horizon. And it's easy to think of examples of this. Suppose there's 5 of us walking around, and at night we say, you know, it would be nice to have some music. Well, one of us knows how to beat on a log with sticks. That's it. That's all we've got for music. If we live in a village of 1,000 people, somebody might be able to play something like a flute or a violin, a stringed instrument, because with 1,000 of us, there's enough of us to supply that person with the resources necessary to specialize in practicing. If you get to the point where you have a city of 1 million, you can have a symphony orchestra. Because there's so many more people, people can specialize in a way that's much deeper. If there's a group of 5 of us, maybe one of us knows how to skin an animal, and then we can tie pieces of that skin around our shoe with some sinew, or maybe a piece of grass. Those are not very good shoes. If there's 1,000 of us, then there's one person who can specialize in the making of shoes. If there's 1 million of us, then people can specialize in making different kinds of shoes. So over and over again, the more people you have, the bigger the cooperation horizon, the greater the division of labor, and the bigger amount of stuff and population that you can support. So the reason for cities is division of labor. The reason for cities is division of labor. Now, an important part of that division of labor is military, there's no question. The most important, probably the first specialization, was military. If you have even 100 or 200 people who are trained full-time to be warriors. Your military power is far greater, not just numerically, but trained warriors with edged metal weapons have a gigantic advantage over a group of 20 people. Not just because they're 100, but also because they've specialized. You can dominate the whole region with a couple of hundred trained warriors with edged weapons. So, division of labor causes cities. First and foremost, because cities are able to defend themselves because some people specialize in military defense. But once that gets started, all the other products of division of labor start to attract more and more people to the cities. You can live better in the city than you can in the country. You have more access to more different kinds of stuff. New technologies, better tools, and weapons to go along with the new way of living. So the three most important aspects of this are tool use, dexterity, and human capital or learning. Tool use means we develop tools for more and more specialized uses. Because once we think of things, if I see somebody else using a tool, I say, oh, I can do that too. Dexterity means that I practice. If I hand you a violin and you don't play the violin, it sounds bad. It takes years and years to learn how to play the violin, particularly if you take it up as an adult. But if you take up the violin or the flute as a child and practice, you can be pretty good fairly quickly, in just a few years. But it takes a while to learn how to do it. It doesn't make sense for anyone to specialize in that in a group of 5. In a group of 1 million, we can specialize. And learning. People learn principles of engineering, building dams, building buildings, sanitation practices that keep us healthy. So knowledge, it wasn't like you could look it up on the internet. Knowledge about relatively simple things, about health, engineering, construction, irrigation, made an enormous difference in how many people we could support. So you can see from a very long time ago discussions of things that look very like division of labor. From Plato's Republic, not quite 400 BC. A state, as I said, arises out of the needs of mankind. No one is self-sufficing. All of us have many wants. Then, as we have many wants and many persons are needed to supply them, one takes a helper and another. When these partners and helpers are gathered together in one habitation, the body of inhabitants is termed a state. They exchange with one another, and one gives and another receives, under the idea that the exchange will be for their good. Now, he's not talking about markets here. He's talking about exchange organized within a city-state. So it's not something we would recognize as markets. It's a system of exchange and specialization organized within a city-state. But very clear that the reason for the state is other people work for you and you work for them. It's the state increases the size of the cooperation horizon. And a larger state means more cooperation. And what's interesting about this is it's not linear. If you double the size of the state, you increase specialization by 10 times or more. It's not linear. You just double the size of the state. You increase cooperation by 10 times or more, because the degree of specialization responds in a way that's more than linear. Division of labor is used within cities. The larger the city, the greater the division of labor. Ibn Khaldun, the Egyptian sociologist and economist from the 14th century, writes famously about what he called cooperation, but it's really about achieving the benefits of specialization. And I give the quote, long quote, because it's not assigned in the reading. So what Ibn Khaldun said was, it's beyond the power of one man alone to do all that, the things above, or even part of it by himself. He cannot do without a combination of many powers from among his fellow beings if he is to obtain food for himself and for them. through cooperation, the needs of a number of persons many times greater than their own number can be satisfied. So what's interesting is he recognized the nonlinear part. So you have a number of persons, they can satisfy the needs of someone, of a group, many times greater than their own number. 5 people can feed 100. Well, that means that the 100 can be doing something else. And they may be doing something that benefit the 5. So there's cooperation without exchange. So this is a story from what I would call the Hebrew Bible, from first book of Samuel. It's from chapter 8. And this is a very famous passage. I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but the story is that Israelites are complaining to Samuel, their judge, because they wanted a king. The elders of Israel gathered together. They came to Samuel and they said, "You are old." That's not a very good way to start out with somebody. "Hey, you're old. And your sons, they do not follow in your ways. Appoint for us then a king to govern us like other nations." Look, Samuel, all the cool kids have a king. We don't have a king. We want to be one of the cool kids. Well, Samuel reported all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking him for a king. He said, Samuel said, and this is what the Lord had told Samuel to say, "These will be the ways of the king who will reign over you. He will take away your sons and appoint them to his chariots and to be his horsemen and to run before his chariots. He will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, these are military units, and to plow his ground and reap his harvest and to make his implements of war and the equipment of his chariots. He'll take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He'll take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive orchards and give them to his courtiers. He'll take 1/10 of your grain and your vineyards and give it to his officers and his courtiers. He'll take your male and female slaves and the best of your cattle and donkeys and put them to his work. He'll take 1/10 of your flocks and you will be his slaves. You will be his slaves. And in that day you will cry out because of your king whom you have chosen for yourselves, but the Lord will not answer you in that day." So basically Samuel was one of those crazy libertarians. Y'all don't want a king? Be serious. Things are going to be terrible if you have a king. And he gives this long list of stuff. And of course the people are immediately persuaded not. They refused to listen to the voice of Samuel. They said, no, we are determined to have a king over us, so that we also may be like the other nations, and that our king may govern us and go out before us and fight our battles. I think they have that wrong. The king will go out and fight your battles for you, instead of the king will take your sons and send them to go fight the battles for him. There's a pretty fundamental misunderstanding of what it is that kings do. When Samuel had heard all the words of the people, he repeated them to the ears of the Lord, and the Lord said to Samuel, "Listen to their voice and set a king over them." Samuel then said to the people of Israel, "Go home." So this is a story of the origin of the nation of Israel. And it's Revelation. I wanted to give an example of Revelation. But it's an odd one, isn't it? It's sort of contradicting what God was telling them to do. God said, "I gave you the law, and the law is what governs you." And they had Samuel, who was a judge, really a rabbi. He's a theocratic judge. So you have the law, you have a judge to say whether you violated the law. And they said, no, we want a king. They wanted an actual state. Well, to have a state, you need a constitution. So that I just read is a story of political constitution. They constituted themselves as a political entity, not a tribe organized around more or less shared religious beliefs. Montesquieu, the French philosopher, was writing about exactly this passage from Samuel when he said, "Man might every instant forget his Creator. God has therefore reminded him of his duty by the laws of religion. Such a being is liable every moment to forget himself. Philosophy is provided against this by the laws of morality. Formed to live in society, he might forget his fellow creatures. Legislators have therefore, by political and civil laws, confined him to his duties. So there's three sets of laws. Montesquieu says there's three sets of laws: religion, morality, and statutes. It's a pretty deep insight. When we talk about laws or rules, they have at least those three origins. And those things have different status. Suppose we think something is immoral, but it's not illegal. Well, you can't get arrested for it. What sanctions do we have for someone who does something that's immoral but not illegal? We can shun them, we can say, oh, you're a bad person, but they won't be arrested. And religion, what if I violate something that's religious? Well, maybe it's not moral if I violate, but religion means that there's some sanctions within the religion. So in the Catholic Church, maybe you're excommunicated, for example. In the Baptist Church, you have to go to a different church. But there's plenty. So religion is revelation, morality is tradition and norms handed down from the past, statutes are laws that are given by the king, the legislature, or some process that are actually written down. Morality may not be written down, religion probably is. Statutes certainly are, morality is almost certainly not, religion possibly. So here's the contract that Thomas Hobbes says we should think of constitutions as being. That a man willing, when others are so too, so far to form as for peace and defense of himself, he shall think it necessary to lay down this right to all things, and be contented with so much liberty against other men as he would allow other men against himself. So it's the same thing that Montesquieu said. This is earlier, so Montesquieu is really repeating this. I am giving up those liberties that I don't want other people to have. Pay attention for a second. This is the key for what Hobbes said. Hobbes said all of us would give up those rights we don't want other people to have. All of us would give up those rights we don't want other people to have. That's the Constitution. Now, my preference would be for me to be able to do that stuff and you not to be able to. And that's your preference too. We can't agree on that. But what we can agree on is we'd be better off if all of us didn't have that right. But, as Hobbes said, covenants without the sword are but words. Covenants without the sword are but words. So you need a big dog. You need something that is going to punish people who violate this agreement. So why would a group want to do that? Why would a group want to form a state rather than just live individually? The answer is division of labor. The reason that there are states, the reason we constitute ourselves, is division of labor. Division of labor is limited by the scope of the cooperation horizon, both temporally and spatially. Having a king, or more generally a state, allows a much larger cooperation horizon. Max Weber, the German sociologist, famously defined a state as a human community that successfully claims the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force within a given territory. So again, there's a bunch of stuff there. The key thing that Weber said is a state is a human community that successfully claims the monopoly of the legitimate use of force within a given territory. Weber, monopoly of the legitimate use of force. Weber, monopoly of the legitimate use of force. That's the definition of a state. Many, many political scientists use that as the definition of a state. A human community that successfully claims a monopoly on the legitimate use of force. Well, we talked before about exchange, and I sent out a video about why do we exchange things. If you haven't watched that, please make sure that you do. Exchange might start if we all have the same preferences or different endowments. It might start if we have the same endowments and different preferences. But it probably starts from specialization. So public choice, the sort of political science that I do, thinks of politics as a kind of exchange. The basis for the exchange in non-market societies is the property rights, defense, public goods. But then why is exchange or trade so important? And the question that was asked before, why aren't those just markets? Well, let's turn now and ask, what about markets? Markets seem unfair because some people are better at everything. Some people are better at everything. Now, my wife is an attorney. She's a litigator. She's terrifying. I am very frightened of her. Every time we start a discussion, I know, okay, I'm not sure what this question is about, but litigators are scary people. You know, an innocent question and then a minute later, bam! Oh, I didn't see that coming. She's not very large, but she's fierce. Well, in addition to being an experienced attorney and litigator, it happens she's an unbelievably good typist. She took some typing in high school and then worked as a clerk for a couple of summers for the US Navy. She can type 80 words a minute. Now, not surprisingly, she has a staff person. She hired a person to do her typing. And my wife finds it very frustrating that this woman that she hired is not a very good typist. But most people don't know much typing now. It's not something you learn that much about unless you practice. So my wife can type 80 words a minute. This woman she hired can type maybe 45 words a minute. Should my wife do the typing instead and fire this woman? No, they said, speaking as if with one voice. No, because even though my wife is a better typist than this woman, my wife is a much better litigator than this woman. It makes more sense for my wife to spend her time as a litigator and pay someone who's not as good at either litigating or typing. So even if someone is better at everything, there are benefits from exchange. That's called the doctrine of comparative advantage. It doesn't have to be an absolute advantage, it's a comparative advantage. So economists make much of the doctrine of comparative advantage. Even if someone's better at everything, you're still better off by specializing and exchanging. What should you specialize in? You should specialize in whatever the opportunity cost of your time is less. Let's see an illustration.
Gather round, everyone, and watch as I work to mow my lawn, build a fence, and install a faucet, all at the same time. How am I going to mow my lawn, build a fence, and install a faucet all at the same time? Through specialization in trade. In another set of videos, we discussed how trade is made of wind, and it is. In this case, I'm able to specialize in what I do best, which is teaching, writing, speaking, and making Learn Liberty videos. I'm able to take the money I earn from all this and then pay people who are better at mowing grass, building fences, and installing faucets than I am. Everybody is better off. Now, I'm sure someone in the comments section is going to say, yeah, but you're terrible at this. You might be right. It just so happens that I'm even worse at cutting grass, building fences, and installing faucets. Don't believe me? Ask whether you'd like to hire me to swing a hammer at your house, or even whether you just let me without having to pay. I'm not so sure you'd like the results. What's cool is that this works even if one person is absolutely better at everything than his or her trading partners. Let's illustrate with a simple example. Let's imagine that Wes, my yard guy, has an awesome lawnmower and can mow a lawn in 30 minutes or prepare a 75-minute economics lecture in an hour. I, on the other hand, take 2 hours to mow a lawn and an hour and a half to prepare the same economics lecture. If we don't specialize in trade, my yard guy Wes spends a total of an hour and a half cutting grass and prepping economics lectures. I, on the other hand, spend 3.5 hours cutting grass and preparing economics lectures. What happens after we specialize? If Wes cuts both lawns and I prepare both economics lectures, he spends an hour cutting grass and I spend 3 hours prepping economics lectures. We both save 30 minutes. That's extra time we can spend doing pretty much anything we want. Here's a true story. We used some of that spare time to have lunch together one day, and Wes, who has a master's degree in philosophy, then used some of his free time to attend one of my lectures and make comments and suggestions. That's just a simple example of the logic behind a simple but profound idea in economics. Trade creates wealth. And thanks to trade, I can cut grass, build fences, and install faucets without hurting myself. Well, not too badly anyway.
That's entertainment. So the point is that Wes was better at everything, but it still helped both of them to specialize in exchange. Because even though Wes was better at everything, he was relatively better at cutting lawns. And Professor Carden was relatively better at preparing economics lectures. So exchange benefits even those who are least well off in a system where division of labor is possible. Here's the thing, economists tend to think that they, or maybe Adam Smith, invented division of labor, and that's wrong. Specialization has existed since at least the Neolithic Revolution, and that was somewhere around 10,000 BCE, 12,000 years ago. Division of labor caused cities. We needed a way to enclose and protect the cooperation horizon. Bigger cities, more cooperation. So it's as if we're talking about the number of people who work for you, but instead of employees, these are people who produce what you need in a cooperative setting. So in a system of division of labor, a lot of people work for me. I just don't even know them. I don't have to tell them what to do. They make stuff that I want, and I make stuff that they want. It happens that the market is a pretty good way of taking advantage of that, which leads us finally to markets. And in particular, Adam Smith's example of the pin factory. This is a drawing of a 18th century pin factory. Adam Smith, in The Wealth of Nations, talks about what he saw as being 18 steps in the making of pins. The first guy draws out the wire, the second one sharpens, all the way to the last guy who puts them in paper and then puts them in boxes. Let me ask, why were there 18 steps and not 24? Because transportation technology limited the extent of the market. They didn't have fast enough ships or a good enough way of handling currency exchange. The more the extent of the market, the more we separate into more and more steps. So production lines that are really complicated, where you've got 30 people making pins, could make enough pins for everybody in the whole world. But if the extent of the market, extent of the cooperation horizon is not large enough, that's too many pins. And so you only have 18 or maybe 6. Or in a small village, 2. Division of labor is limited by the extent of the market. Just as generally, division of labor is limited by the cooperation horizon. In a market setting, division of labor is limited by the extent of the market. So Smith's two main insights are, first, division of labor would be powerful even if all human beings were clones. And he gives an example of what he calls the philosopher and the porter. And this would totally be the sort of question that you might expect on the midterm, is about Smith's philosopher and the porter. This is from Adam Smith. The very different genius which appears to distinguish men of different professions when grown up to maturity is not, upon many occasions, so much the cause as the effect of the division of labor. Being English, he doesn't know how to spell labor. The difference between the most dissimilar characters, between a philosopher and a common street porter, for example, seems to arise not so much from nature as from habit, custom, and education. Well, that's a pretty radical nature versus nurture claim. Smith seems to believe in nurture. Almost all people are basically equal. They become things by doing that job. So you might take twins, one of whom doesn't have any educational opportunity and the other one does. One of them ends up a philosopher and the other one a porter. And you might say, oh, that philosopher must have been smart. But in fact, maybe all he had was better education opportunities. Well, but that's what division of labor does. If you work for 10,000 hours on learning to play the violin, you'll be able to play the violin, and a person who hasn't done that won't. Are you in some way intrinsically better? No, you spent 10,000 hours learning how to do it. Division of labor means that through specializing, we can develop talents those talents wouldn't pay in a smaller society. So what you want is to have the largest possible extent. You want to have a cooperation horizon that is larger. Larger cooperation horizons reward greater division of labor. Which brings us to the second insight. The dynamic impact of division of labor gives rise to market institutions. Exchange relations relentlessly push against borders and expand the effective locus of cooperation. So what do we call this? That's globalization. Markets cause globalization. Markets want to be global. Now, globalization has many other effects that you might think are bad, particularly on domestic producers, and we'll talk about those more. But in terms of a consumer, I want all markets to be global. The whole world works for me. I can buy better stuff more cheaply if all markets are global. Division of labor causes markets to globalize. Division of labor is limited by the extent of the market. The larger the market, the more division of labor, the more specialization, the cheaper and better products I can get. We have to solve problems of transportation, transaction, and trust. We have to solve those three problems. But we have a pretty globalized economy. We've largely solved for many nations at least some of that problem. And Smith actually has a chapter title, Chapter 3 in Book 1 of The Wealth of Nations. A chapter title. It's amazing that the division of labor is limited by the extent of the market. So if you take nothing else from this lecture today, it should be that one sentence. The division of labor is limited by the extent of the market. In summary then, division of labor is the most important causal force for understanding social systems and organizations we observe around us. That's true whether you favor a socialist system or a market system. Division of labor determines social structures in both socialist and market systems. Division of labor is partly the product of the ancient evolved capacity humans have to cooperate and trust. We are built to cooperate. Altruism, in the sense of self-sacrifice, is entirely unnecessary in such a system. Mutual benefit by cooperation over space and time is the cause of most of the organizing principles we observe. The particular, though recent, and in terms of human history, very recent, genius of markets is that market systems allow the scope of cooperation horizon to go global. So, for a long time, what you wanted was a large city, because all of the exchanges happened within the city. The genius of markets is that they exchange across cities. They exchange across cities at great distance from each other, both physical distance and cultural distance. You can obviously have a much bigger cooperation horizon if you exchange across cities than within cities. That's the particular genius of markets. That's why we're going to spend a lot of time thinking about economics. See you Monday.